The year was 1942, and the United States 8th Air Force was learning a lethal lesson in the skies over occupied Europe. The public back home was being fed a diet of heroic newsreels, the invincible flying fortress, the precision bombing, and the brave crews in their sheepskin jackets. But inside the hangars of England, the reality was much darker. Every time a B-17 or B-24 limped back to base, it wasn't just trailing smoke, it was a flying triage center. The man standing on the tarmac, watching the red flares go up from the cockpits, was Colonel Malcolm Grow. As the chief surgeon of the 8th Air Force, his job was to fix the broken bodies that fell out of those planes. But Grow was starting to realize that his scalpel was no match for the German 88mm shell. Grow began a gruesome but necessary study. He spent weeks in the hospitals and on the airfields, meticulously mapping every wound on every survivor. He noticed something that the armchair generals in Washington had missed. The crews weren't being killed by high-velocity bullets from German fighters. Instead, they were being shredded by flak, the jagged, glowing hot shards of steel from anti-aircraft shells exploding outside the plane. This wasn't a clean entry and exit. This was low-velocity fragmentation. When an 88mm shell burst, it sent a cloud of razor-sharp shrapnel through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber. To the human body inside, that aluminum was no more protective than a sheet of wet paper. The medical reality was a nightmare. These hot metal fragments didn't just pierce the skin, they dragged pieces of the airmen's greasy flight suits and sheepskin linings deep into the wounds, causing catastrophic infections and internal hemorrhaging. Grow found that a staggering 70% of casualties were caused by these specific fragments hitting the vital triangle, the chest, the abdomen, and the neck. He saw men who had survived a 4-hour flight with their lungs collapsed, only to die on the operating table because a piece of steel the size of a coin had bounced around their ribcage like a pinball. But when Grow brought this data to the Ordnance Department, he hit a wall of bureaucratic logic. The military experts argued that body armor was a relic of the Middle Ages. They claimed that adding steel plates to a crew would add too much weight, forcing the bombers to carry fewer bombs or less fuel. There was even a darker psychological argument. Some officials believed that giving a man armor would damage his morale by making him focus on his own mortality instead of the mission. They thought it would make the crews cowardly. Grow sat in his office looking at the photos of shredded teenagers and realized that the brass were more worried about the weight of the plane than the weight of the lives inside. He knew the physics. These flak fragments were moving relatively slowly. They didn't need a foot of tank armor to stop them. They just needed a thin shield. But with the Pentagon refusing to fund a knight-in-shining armor project, Grow realized that if he wanted to save his boys, he was going to have to stop being a polite officer and start being a rogue surgeon. This act concludes with Grow making a secret trip to London, not to meet with military officials, but to visit a legendary sword-making shop that had been forging steel since the 1700s. He was about to start a private war against the German flak batteries, and he didn't care who in Washington got angry about it. Colonel Malcolm Grow knew that if he went through official channels, his men would be dead before the first prototype was even blueprinted. He needed a partner who understood steel, not bureaucracy. In the winter of 1942, Grow made a quiet trip to London to meet with the master craftsman at Wilkinson's sword. This wasn't a choice made at random. Wilkinson had spent centuries perfecting the balance between weight and protection. Grow sat down with their engineers and laid out his grim findings. He didn't want a suit of armor for a knight on a horse. He wanted a shield for a man sitting in a vibrating, freezing aluminum box at 25,000 feet.
The challenge was immense. The armor had to be light enough for a crewman to move, flexible enough for a gunner to swing his weapon, and, most importantly, it had to be removable in a heartbeat. If a B-17 started to spiral toward the North Sea, a soldier couldn't be trapped in 10 pounds of steel. Together, Grow and the Wilkinson Smiths developed the M1 Flyer's vest. It was a masterpiece of unauthorized engineering. 3 overlapping plates of manganese steel sewn into a heavy canvas carrier that covered the front and back of the torso. It looked like something from the Battle of Agincourt, but it was built for the space age. To solve the weight issue, Grow focused only on the vital triangle, the heart, lungs, and liver. But his stroke of genius was the quick-release cord. With one sharp tug on a single ripcord located at the shoulder, the entire vest would fall away from the body in less than a second. This ensured that if a crewman had to bail out, the weight of the armor wouldn't drag him to the bottom of the English Channel or interfere with his parachute deployment. It was a life-saving feature born from a surgeon's understanding of panic and physics. However, Grow still had no official funding and no permission. He bypassed the Pentagon and convinced the commander of the 305th Bomb Group, Colonel Curtis LeMay, to let him run a field test. Grow personally handed out the first 10 vests to a group of waist gunners, the men standing at open windows who were the most frequent victims of flak. He told them it was an experimental trial, but the men saw it for what it was. Someone finally cared about their survival more than the weight of the fuel. The field test didn't take long to produce results. During a particularly brutal raid over the U-boat pens at St. Nazaire, a piece of 88mm flak, a jagged chunk of steel the size of a man's palm, tore through the side of a B-17 and slammed into a gunner's chest. The impact was enough to knock him off his feet, but he didn't feel the familiar searing heat of metal entering his lungs. He stood up, bruised and gasping, and looked down. The steel plate in his vest was dented and scorched, but it hadn't been breached. Word of the miracle vest spread through the air bases like wildfire. Suddenly, every pilot in the 8th Air Force wanted one. When the official reports reached the Pentagon, the unauthorized label became a badge of honor. The data was undeniable. In the first few missions where the vests were worn, chest and abdominal injuries dropped by 60%. The rogue surgeon had proven the generals wrong. Grow's steel vest wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was the psychological turning point the mighty 8th desperately needed. The era of the unshielded bomber crew was over, and the production lines in the U.S. were ordered to start turning out Grow's design by the tens of thousands.
By 1943, the unauthorized steel vest was no longer a secret. It was a requirement. The Pentagon, once the biggest hurdle to the project, scrambled to catch up with Colonel Grau's success. The design was standardized as the M1 Flyer's vest, and American factories shifted into high gear. What started as a few handmade plates in a London sword shop was now being mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands. But the impact of the vest went far beyond the casualty reports. It changed the very nature of the air war. The psychological shift was immediate. Before the vest, bomber crews felt like sitting ducks in a tin can. They were flying through flak hells where the sky turned black with smoke, knowing that a single random shard of metal could end their lives in a second. With the arrival of the steel vest, the mighty 8th found its second wind. Morale soared. Crewmen began to treat their vests with a near religious respect, often personalizing them with nose art or lucky charms. The vest didn't just protect their hearts, it protected their resolve. The statistics that followed were staggering. Medical surveys conducted after the rollout revealed that the vest reduced the lethality of flak wounds by over 50%. In many bomb groups, chest wounds, once a guaranteed death sentence at 25,000 feet, became survivable injuries that allowed men to return to duty within weeks. Colonel Grau's rogue experiment had successfully defanged one of Germany's most terrifying weapons. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun was still deadly, but it was no longer the undisputed butcher of the skies. As the war drew to a close, the legacy of the steel vest began to evolve. The lessons learned in the freezing cockpits of B-17s were passed down to the next generation of soldiers. The M1 vest became the direct ancestor of the flak jackets worn by Marines in the Korean War and the soldiers in the jungles of Vietnam. Malcolm Grau's insistence on the quick-release mechanism and the protection of the vital triangle became the gold standard for every piece of body armor designed in the 20th century. Malcolm Grau didn't just save lives during WW2, he fundamentally changed how the military viewed the survival of the individual soldier. He was eventually promoted to Major General and became the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force. But his greatest monument wasn't his rank or his medals. It was the thousands of grandfathers, fathers, and sons who came home from the war because a doctor decided that unauthorized was a price worth paying for their lives. The steel vest proved that sometimes the most effective weapon on the battlefield isn't the one that kills, but the one that refuses to let the enemy win.
Found today's intel useful? Like and subscribe to stay in the loop. You watched the full report. Well done. More dossiers are coming. Thanks for joining the team.